LBJ's own mouth delivers the final and most damning evidence. He knew what was about to happen to JFK. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see the video. LBJ is hollering at somebody, giving JFK bad looks. JFK tries to draw him back. You're walking down a hall. LBJ is continually giving JFK the bad, evil eye, I call it. The evil eye. And once again, he's in Austin. Maybe some remorse for what was coming. He gave kind of...
I do not run for the office of the presidency after 14 years in the Congress with any expectation that it is an empty or an easy job. I run for the presidency of the United States because it is the center of action. And in a free society, the chief responsibility of the president is to set before the American people the unfinished public business of our country.
Of all White House occupants, none has been more confident of his right to live there than John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He has fought hard for it. With his Boston-bred accent, his darting wit, and ringing political challenges, he has brought a new generation to rule. Inaugurated at 43, he accepted power as if this were his natural destiny. He enjoys being president. With his gently spoken, radiant wife, he has brought a new excitement to the pillared mansion on Pennsylvania Avenue. A nation of neighbors discreetly watches its spirited first family, smiles at children bouncing across the barriers of protocol.
City, West Tampa, all the Civic Club, would like to present you this humidor full of cigars. Also from the Tampa Cigar Industry and Cigar Festival Association.
President Kennedy is in Tampa
My daughter Marlene would like to make a present.
on his tour of cities for the upcoming election in '64.
President Kennedy, this shot is for your daughter Caroline.
It turns out the guy that's giving the doll for Caroline is the brother, her father is the brother of a general.
Almost unnoticed on Tuesday morning is Vice President
Kennedy fired.
Arrival by commercial airliner to address
Johnson met with an assortment of the man who killed Kennedy the evening before the assassination.
For his Texas tour. On Thursday, November 21st, by White House helicopter, the President makes the familiar flight over the Capitol's parks and Greystone vistas to nearby Andrews Air Force Base. Forever shy of public hurly-burly, yet herself an incalculable political asset, Jacqueline Kennedy has decided to accompany her husband to Texas, their first such trip together since his election. Waiting is Air Force One, the designation given any plane the President flies. This morning, as usual, it is number 26,000, an airborne command post from which he can communicate with points.
What most people don't know is that Jackie Kennedy had a third child just before this trip. A child died of premature. Wasn't developed enough. Wasn't that premature today. It probably would have lived with today's technology. They're getting on the plane now, heading for their tour of Texas.
At Fort Worth's Texas Hotel, where the President and Mrs. Kennedy will spend this Thursday night. Landing first in San Antonio at 2:30 Thursday afternoon, the President inspects a new aerospace medical center. At 3:30, he is again airborne for his next stop, Houston. Is this evening, the President will climax his political efforts by speaking at a banquet in Houston honoring local Congressman Albert Thomas. But before the speech, the President and his lady surprise a delighted gathering of Spanish-speaking citizens by an impromptu appearance.
Well, I'm glad to be here today, and in order that my words will be even clearer, I'm going to ask my wife to say a few words to you also.
Estoy muy contenta de estar en el gran estado de Texas, de estar con ustedes que forman parte de la noble tradición española que tanto ha contribuido a Texas. Esta tradición comenzó 100 años antes de que se colonizó Massachusetts, el estado de Maryland. Pero es una tradición que se mantiene viva y vigorosa.
And this video shows somebody, if you happen to be watching it again on YouTube, when they finish up with Mrs. Kennedy speaking to the Spanish population at this meeting, you'll see a guy with a hat sitting at one of the front row tables who just has the most heinous look towards the President and Mrs. Kennedy. But, you know, there was this idea that there was, this isn't big government. This is a bunch of dirty politicians, dirty crooks, and not the deep state. The deep state hasn't emerged yet. This was beginning of what was going to become the deep state, but it wasn't there at this time. And when we failed to take the appropriate action at this time when it happened, this is what led us into the big ball of furs and shit that we're in today.
I know that anything I would say would be anticlimactic in the light of what this lovely, gracious lady has said. But I know that I speak for all of you when I say that we are very proud and very happy that we
are the group any part of a church gathering or at a wedding. It was totally revealing what LBJ said.
Can have our beloved president, 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 and our First Lady with us here this evening.
And that only leaves you with the last recourse, but a funeral, a farewell, goodbye.
Of the United States on the streets of Dallas on November 22nd, 1963.
If the presidency of the United States is being decided by bullets fired from rifles rather than ballots cast by citizens, we have indeed been taken over by a whole new form of government.
A growing majority of Americans refuse to accept the official version of events, that a lone assassin murdered their president.
Those of us who want the truth, want to really learn what happened here, keep asking these questions because it tells a lot about ourselves, about our values, and ultimately the direction of our country.
New information about Kennedy's murder continues to emerge, confirming that the truth has been withheld from the American people.
We're very lucky that there at least are people who individually have now convinced the vast majority against the mainstream media that the Warren Commission got it wrong.
From his hometown of Duluth in Minnesota, one of those questioning critics of the official version of events is Professor James Fetzer.
The resurgence...
Once again, this is from this episode that was on the History Channel. It is called The Smoking Guns. It's one of 3 or 4 episodes that they pulled. We happen to have the whole, I think it was 8 or 9, 10 episodes. So, we'll continue with it. Just want to let you know, if you're watching the video, you know what's going on. If you're not, if you're just listening to us on the podcast, hey, you're listening to the Experiment Club. I'm Dave Gregory. Be sure to support our page. Be sure to contribute. We're in dire need of a new handicap van. I'm in a wheelchair, and I have a 20-year-old van. It doesn't have to be a brand new one, but it's got to be newer than 20 years old. So much appreciated. Now back to the bonus material for the JFK killing.
Of interest in the death of JFK had repercussions when Congress passed the JFK Records Act in 1992 that created a 5-civilian-member board entrusted with the responsibility to review and declassify documents that were held by the CIA, the Secret Service, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and so forth. We know from its own report that it had some significant failures. For example, and the Secret Service, which deliberately destroyed motorcade records that would have revealed that the motorcade in Dallas was a travesty, a violation of at least 15 different Secret Service policies for presidential protection. This behavior on their part raises the most serious and disturbing questions about their complicity in the entire affair.
From the moment he arrived in Dallas, the president's protection was suspect, according to Vince Palomara, a Secret Service expert.
There was last-minute changes invoked by the Secret Service involving President Kennedy's security. Specifically, agents were told not to ride on or near the rear of the limousine. Now, these orders were funneled from the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the White House detail, who was the planner of the Texas trip, Floyd Boring, to one of his assistants, a shift leader by the name of Emory Roberts, who was in charge of the follow-up car. You can see an agent, Henry Ribka, doing his normal duty, jogging besides the limousine, when in the follow-up car, you can see Emory Roberts stand up and wave him back, and you can see a very perplexed Agent Ribka waving his arms in the air several times in seeming disgust. There was another last-minute change made at Love Field, invoked by the Secret Service. The Dallas Police Department motorcycle outriders were told not to be beside the car. It went from 4 to 6 down to a measly 2 riders on each side. And to add insult to injury, they were pushed further back in the motorcade by those agents not being by the car, by those motorcycle officers not being in position. It opened up President Kennedy to a field of fire from in front and from the rear.
In the months before the trip to Texas, there had been a growing number of threats against the president's life.
Despite the increase in conspiratorial activity in the month of November 1963, in the apparent red alert the Secret Service appears to be under in response to this activity, the agency acts in the opposite fashion and actually reduces the security and acts like no threats on the president's life are occurring. Why?
Uniquely on that day in Dallas, the press, the camera crews, Kennedy's military aide, who would normally sit in the front of the president's car, and even his personal physician were all relegated to the rear of the motorcade by the Secret Service.
In a conventional motorcade, the president would be somewhere in the middle, surrounded by security and the press. In this case, the presidential limousine was set right out in front of every other limousine, which of course is the reason why the Secret Service destroyed the records of its own motorcades when they were asked for them by the Assassination Records Review Board.
The most suspicious behavior by shift leader Emory Roberts was to be at the time of the shooting in Dealey Plaza.
Tragically, he actually ordered the agents not to move during the heart of the shooting. Agent Sam Kinney, who drove the follow-up car, admitted as much to me and told me, quote, exactly right, end quote. And all these deficiencies begin and end with the Secret Service because they were the prime movers. They were the ones who were directing the security arrangements from Washington up to and including in the heart of Dallas during security meetings. They were the ones that gave out assignments, vetoed or approved of security arrangements. So the buck stops with them.
At Parkland Hospital after the president's death, the media were reporting that the fatal shots had come from in front of the presidential car.
A press conference was conducted by Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff at 1:30 after the president had been pronounced dead at 1 o'clock. Malcolm Kilduff explained that it had been a simple matter of a bullet right through the head while pointing to his right temple and attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician. This wound to the right temple and another wound to the throat, 3 different times described as a wound of entry, were widely broadcast on radio and television that afternoon. They were quickly suppressed because, of course, they contradicted the official government account, which was that 3 shots had been fired, all of them from above and behind.
Connie Kritzberg was a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald on November 22, 1963. A couple of hours after the assassination, she did a phone interview with 2 of the principal doctors who had tended Kennedy.
I talked to Dr. Kim Clark, who was head of neurosurgery at Parkland Hospital, and Dr. Malcolm Perry. So I asked, how many wounds were there in the president? And I was told Dr. Kim Clark said there was a gaping wound in the back of the head. And Dr. Perry said, the wound I was working on was an entrance wound in the neck. And I asked him where it was located. I asked him, was it below the Adam's apple? He said, yes, it was in the midline, in the front of the neck, below the Adam's apple. And he said 3 times that it was an entrance wound from the front. And so I wrote a very simple story, only about 12 inches long as we measured stories, and turned it in.
The next morning, Connie found the story she filed had changed.
I found in the story, in about the 3rd paragraph, there had been a very unprofessional sentence inserted. It said, a doctor admitted there was possibly 1 wound. So I was very upset. I called the city desk and I talked to one of the assistant city editors whom I respected quite a bit, and I said, who changed my story? Who put in that sentence? And he immediately knew what I was talking about. He said, the FBI. A story couldn't be printed that there was more than 1 shot and that 1 came from the front. It had to be altered, no matter how crudely, to conform to the official story that there were 3 shots from 1 place, from 1 man, and it was only 1 man who committed the murder.
Confirmation of what Connie was told by Dr. Perry comes from one of his colleagues who also attended the fatally wounded president at Parkland Hospital, the late Dr. Charles Crenshaw.
Prior to the tracheostomy performed by Dr. Perry, I observed in the lower third of the neck a small, rounded, well-demarcated entrance wound. This was obliterated by the tracheostomy in that Dr. Perry made the tracheostomy incision through the entrance wound. Different parts of the tissues were spread. He then made the incision into the trachea, and through the hole that had previously been made by the entrance of the bullet, the tracheostomy was put in place.
Radio reports from Dallas that afternoon mentioned the small round wound of entry in the front of the president's neck. They were heard by the late Dr. Robert Livingston, who was then scientific director of the National Institute for Mental Health.
The reports had been that the president had been shot from the rear, from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. And the evidence at hand from the Parkland Hospital doctors of a small, neat wound in the neck was contradictory to that, or at least complementary to that, in the sense that it required that there be a shot from in front, so that if he were shot from the rear, he was also being shot at the same time from in front. So I wanted to tell whoever was going to do the autopsy about that, and so I telephoned Bethesda Naval Hospital. The officer of the day I knew, and he put me quickly through to Dr. James Humes, who was going to head the autopsy team. He was very cordial, and we had a good conversation, brief. He had not heard about the neck wound. I told him that it was important because it was a wound of entrance, and I told him that it should be explored completely for its track and to find any bullet or fragments of bullets that would remain, and particularly emphasized that it had to be a frontal wound since there was no tearing of the tissues. He left the telephone momentarily and came back and said, "Dr. Livingston, I'm sorry I can't continue this conversation. The FBI won't let me."
Humes later claimed he only learnt about that bullet wound after the autopsy from one of the Dallas doctors. He never examined it.
I'm absolutely certain about that telephone call. I'm sure that Dr. Humes got a clear impression from me about the neck wound representing a wound of entrance.
Further corroboration of a shot fired from in front of Kennedy's car came from the late Dr. Evalia Glanges in her only filmed interview. She was no stranger to guns.
I've been handling guns since I was a child. Couldn't even hold the gun. I had to put it on the fence in order to shoot it. On the morning of November the 22nd, 1963, I was a second-year medical student at Southwestern Medical University in Dallas, Texas. We ran around the side of the building to the emergency room exit, and the presidential limousine was there. Had been standing there for some time just watching the back of the emergency room when I realized that there was a bullet hole in the windshield. Talked to my friend next to me and said, "Look, there's a bullet hole in the windshield," and pointed it out to them. At the time, I did not know any of the details of the shooting. I was quite shocked when I looked up and saw the bullet hole, but it was very clear. It was a through and through bullet hole through the windshield of the car from the front to the back. I don't believe there's even any cracks associated with that bullet hole. It seemed like a high-velocity bullet that had penetrated from front to back in that glass pane. At which point, a security officer of some type raced forward and jumped in the limousine and drove it off, even as I was leaning against it, to an area back of us somewhere. And that was the last time I saw the limousine.
The Secret Service made certain no authority in Dallas had an opportunity to examine the bullet damage to Kennedy's car.
The Secret Service also usurped Dallas authority and removed the Kennedy limousine from Parkland Hospital and flew that limousine back to Washington, D.C.
For over a decade, researcher Doug Weldon, a professor of criminal justice and an attorney, has studied Kennedy's limousine and what happened to it in the hours after the assassination.
Just as the president's body in an autopsy could have given us many answers, a thorough study of that limousine at that time without evidence being tampered with would also have given us many important answers as to what really happened.
But on arrival in Washington, damage to the limousine was noted.
Charles Taylor Jr., the Secret Service agent who had accompanied Samuel Kinney in driving the vehicle to the White House garage from Andrews Air Force Base, noted in his report that of particular significance, just left to center of the windshield was a small hole from which it appeared that bullet fragments had been removed. Nick Prunspy, a United States Police Park officer, also had an opportunity to take a look at the vehicle while it was in the White House garage. He noted that there was a small hole in the windshield And based upon his many years of experience as a police officer, he noted that that hole had been caused by a bullet.
Over the ensuing days, the car was scrutinized in the White House garage by a number of people. But one day was different.
If one examines the White House garage logs, it is very interesting that in the late evening of November 24th, 1963, and the entire day of November 25th, 1963, not one person is listed as having come in to the White House garage to have any contact with the limousine.
Rumors circulated at the time always denied that the presidential car was secretly flown from Washington to the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, for the removal of its damaged windshield.
It is very clear that the only mode of transportation that could have been used to transport the limousine from Washington, D.C. to the Dearborn plant would have been via airplane.
There are several airports in the Detroit area. It would have been a simple matter to transport the limousine undercover to its final destination, the Ford Motor Company's Rouge plant. The late George Whitaker Sr., seen here with his wife, was a lifetime employee with Ford and held a managerial position at the Rouge plant. He went to work on the morning of November 25th to be confronted by an amazing sight.
He was astonished when he went to the B building where garage existed at that time, and he saw the Kennedy limousine that John F. Kennedy had been murdered in. The interior of the limousine had completely been stripped, and the windshield was not in the limousine. He went to the glass lab where he was in charge of laminating glass, and the glass lab door was locked. He knocked on the door, and it was open, and two of his subordinates were in there with the windshield that had been removed from the vehicle. They were under orders to take that windshield and use it as a template in making a new windshield. But what fascinated him, and which he discussed with his family and no one else until he spoke with me, was that he saw a hole in the windshield.
Good clean billable right straight through the front. Right, this had a clean round hole in the front and fragments on the front of that.
Mr. Whitaker had 30 years of experience working with glass and had seen many tests performed on glass, including tests performed with firearms. He described that hole as being in the same location that Charles Taylor Jr. of the Secret Service had described the hole in his report, and of course without knowing that anybody had observed it before then. But he also was absolutely 100% convinced that that shot had to emanate from the front of the Kennedy limousine.